Coaching as Benevolence, a podcast for people who are curious about using coaching for self-development. I'm Erin with Roots and Wings Grief and Loss Coaching.
And I'm LaShawn with Michelle Sage Place Positive Intelligence Coaching.
All right, today we are so excited to have one of our neighbors and friends with us today, Margot Zaher, who is the owner of Empowered Now Coaching, where transformation meets tangible results. As a certified professional coach, Enneagram coach, and hypnotherapist, Margot brings a unique blend of expertise to her coaching business. Her deep understanding of human behavior through the lens of the Enneagram, combined with her mastery of psychological principles, allows her to unlock the full potential for her clients. Margot's 10-year experience as a co-owner of a consulting firm, combined with a master's in psychology and an MBA, provide her with a comprehensive foundation to address both the inner and outer aspects of success for entrepreneurs and professionals. Wow, Margot, you have quite the background. I love it. Her holistic approach encompasses mindset empowerment, productivity enhancement, and revenue acceleration through strategic sales and marketing techniques. So I just shared a lot about you in your bio, so thank you for sharing that with us as well. So Margot, just to get us started here today, what else would you like to share generally about yourself before we get into our conversation?
Wow, thank you for that amazing intro. Well, in general, I've been doing this sort of work for a long time. Since 2000 was when I was first certified as a life coach, and I started working with entrepreneurs way back then. So it's been quite a journey, 25 years of doing some sort of form of coaching, lots of twists and turns in the road. And then on the Enneagram, I know we're going to talk a lot about that, but I was first introduced to the Enneagram in 2003. So it's also been a long journey, and began studying it very, I would say, in depth in 2006, and became certified as a coach much later on when I found a coaching program that could help me really learn how to help people identify their types through an Enneagram typing process. So yes, I'm all into education and learning a lot of things.
Yeah, that must be a strength of yours, being a learner.
Yeah.
So we'll pass it over to LaShawn. Oh,
yeah, absolutely. When you are working with clients, what's a typical session with a new client?
Well, I would say of course, every session is very different depending on what my clients want. I do a lot of tailored one-on-one work. And since we're focusing a lot here today on the Enneagram, I'm going to speak more about the approach that's more Enneagram focused. So I believe that either somebody comes to me, they're knowing their type, or I do a personalized typing session to help them determine their core type and their wing. And basically what I do during, I would say, a first couple of sessions, specifically the first one, it helps them really identify what's actually happening. Because a lot of the entrepreneurs that come to me are kind of stuck. Either they feel like they're plateauing with their success, they're plateauing with their life. They feel like they're been going a little bit in circles. Maybe there's fear or lack of direction or motivation that's stopping them. And so a lot of what this is about in the first session is helping them really look at kind of what's underneath. What are the underpinnings? What are those core fears that are there? Those motivations there? What's really driving their behavior? And what might also be sabotaging them? And then we build a coaching plan around that.
That's awesome. Can you describe a little bit more about what the Enneagram is?
Yeah, so the Enneagram, Ennea means 9 in Greek, and gram refers to a diagram. So it has Greek roots, actually. Very interestingly, the philosophers Aristotle, Socrates were one of the first people to come up with this term. It really, at that time, was a lot looser, more archetypal with energies that they were seeing in their environment. But what it really means is that it's a framework to really look at how you are operating as a human being. And there's 9 different types. And what makes it different than other, I would say, personality profiling systems is that it really looks more at what's driving your behavior, what's motivating you versus the outward behavior patterns. And what also is very fascinating with the Enneagram is that it's like a roadmap for growth, because each point has a stress point that you can work on avoiding with certain strategies. And each point has also what we call a growth point or integration point, that if you access that, you can help evolve your type to the higher levels of functioning for your type.
As you were speaking, Margot, I thought about our episode about the growth zone and how both Erin and I were talking about what would that be like, to live or exist in the growth zone or the growth zone where you're at your highest potential and you're just expanding and growing on that. Can you speak a little bit about that with the Enneagram and how with the different types, what that would look like?
Yes. Definitely. Well, that's what I'm so fascinated about with the Enneagram, is that I love how it's a roadmap to figure out where to focus your awareness. So each type has a natural integration point. And so we can kind of look around the clock quickly. Maybe I can do a quick one for each type, but like type one, who's a reformer and tends to be very structured and more rigid in their way of thinking about things. Their actual growth point is type 7, which is the enthusiast, the adventurer, the one that really wants to get the most out of life. And they tend to go for it and go into the unknown and really, get zest out of life. So the point in that is it really helps the one get out of that rigid framework and into this more joyous, spontaneous place by looking at strategies to go that direction. Do you want me to go with more types, or how many would you like me to describe?
Sure, maybe one or two more examples. Yeah.
So, how about I do one that's kind of a little further along on it, because it's my type. I'll go with type 6, the type 6, which is the loyal skeptic or the devil's advocate, they're called. So the type 6, one of their big challenges is kind of self-doubt and seeking reassurance outside of themselves. And so type 9 is your integration point. And type 9 is all about being able to focus more inward on the body. It's a body type 9, and get really in touch with more your gut and make decisions from your gut and from your own sense of self-awareness versus looking outward for reassurance, getting reassurance from inside. And so a type 6 who focuses on type 9 and really works with that energy is able to make decisions more independently of others and faster and with more assurance that they're right in what they're doing for themselves.
Yeah, I love that example. And I can see how that would be a helpful reassurance for most types, right? I see that in the coaching clients I work with, sometimes that external validation might need to be present because it's part of human nature. But even by having this framework that you have with the Enneagram, that can just be such a nice tool for people to see that they're not alone in that, right? Or they're not, there's nothing wrong with them. It's just, this is a growth point that they can access.
Exactly. Actually, one of the things that I love the most about the Enneagram is that it makes you feel like nothing's wrong with you, that things that you have thought about a lot of times, like, oh my gosh, why do I have all these problems? Why do I behave this way? It allows you to see, I just adapted a strategy. I took on a strategy when I was younger, and this is just a strategy I have. And I can choose to operate in a higher way with this strategy, but it gives you a sense of like, oh, I'm just one of these strategies, and it doesn't make you bad. It gives you a lot more, doesn't make you feel bad about yourself. It makes you feel better about yourself and more self-compassion towards self. And it helped me understand a lot of the ways that I was operating as an entrepreneur in my life and how I was self-sabotaging. And it gave me a lot more compassion for myself.
Yeah, looking back kind of on, all your career pivots and all the advanced degrees you have with the certifications, how is your awareness with the Enneagram woven through those, and how did that inform next steps for yourself?
And that's a really fascinating question. I think the Enneagram has had like a gigantic impact on my life. The thing that it's helped the most with is decision making, because as I was saying before, the type 6 is like the seesaw of the Enneagram. So I think I'll do that. I don't want to do that. That's a great idea. That's a terrible idea. And so there's so much waffling going back and forth that it can be really hard to make a decision. because it's based so much on external validation and what does everybody else think? I'm going to ask a million people and get a million answers, and then I'm totally lost. And what really helped me along the path is the more I tapped into the power of the Enneagram and really worked on integrating type 9 and also getting more at peace with my core challenge, which is the need for security, realizing that security didn't really exist and it was okay to actually not have security to advance forward in life, the more I was able to make decisions from my heart versus decisions from my mind. And for instance, one big career pivot that was immense for me was actually leaving the corporate world, leaving the consulting world at different places in my life and going into having my own business and taking those risks and making decisions as an entrepreneur that were sometimes scary and unknown. And deciding to even recently launch my own podcast, the Enneagram Edge podcast. Like, this is something that I'm almost always aware of as a type 6, that there's this desire for security and reassurance and yes, it's always going to work out. But yet, because I know that, okay, that's just part of what's here, but that's not the truth. I can go more with what my heart really wants and what is really true for me.
I really like the balance between head and heart that's coming up a lot in your discussion about the Enneagram, and also just the self-compassion piece of it as well. And really understanding this is a process, and this is something that Erin and I talk about a lot, things being a process. When you work with a client and they come in with one type and you work with them and you're you're exploring different ways that they can address their fears and also their challenges, and also work on their strengths as well. Can you just tell us a story about, of course, not naming any names, but just a story of a client who comes in at let's say 6 and gets to 9? Or can you just tell what things that you saw with this client, or what challenges they faced that they were able to overcome as a result of understanding their Enneagram type better?
Yeah, I have a story that I've been thinking about because it was super impactful. And I think a lot of your potential listeners could relate to this. This is a type 1 entrepreneur who has a business, but it's not thriving. And she has a 2 wing. So basically, type 1 is the reformer, the perfectionist, and a 2 wing is the helper on the Enneagram. So she's stuck, and she comes to see me in this kind of constant struggle between her family. She has young kids at home, and her business, and feeling super guilty when she's not available for her kids, and then trying to figure out when do I work on my business? When am I available for my kids? And what's happening is that she's pushing a lot of her work to the side and getting kind of mediocre results in her business, thinking, well, maybe I just have to settle for this because I have young kids at home. But she's also unhappy with herself because she feels like she has so much more potential. And so there's this real inner struggle that she came to me with. So one thing that I look at the Enneagram is recognizing patterns. I think patterns, especially built on, I would say, limiting belief systems. And so it's helpful to look at the type 1 in this, because the type 1 has a really high standard, right? They want to be like the perfect mom, right? And so that's what type 1 is trying to get. And type 2 is I need to be needed at all costs and take care of everybody. So it's kind of like the superhero is showing up here, right? And if she dares to say no to her child, maybe she's not going to be loving enough. Maybe they're going to say, oh, you're selfish. And the worst thing for a type 2, and if you have a lot of this, is to be called selfish. You want to be really looked at as a selfless, supportive, beautiful, loving human being, right? So anyway, what I helped her really see, because a type 1, I just helped her actually work on really getting in touch with the type 1 values, because this is what was happening. She has these strong values for integrity and for modeling self-discipline and responsibility and purpose, because that's what a type 1's about. She wants to be fulfilling her purpose and having impact on the planet. And yet part of her is, but I got to take care of my kids. I want to impact. I got to take care of my kids. And so what I helped her do was actually reframe this, that she was actually going to be showing her kids how to model self-discipline, responsibility, and help her instill values in her kids of actually, you have a purpose on this planet. And it really helped her feel more comfortable with oh, I am being an example to my kids of how to operate as a business owner, how to set boundaries. So she was able to restructure her time differently and really got much more into being able to have sacred commitments for herself, sacred commitments for her kids. And then the really great thing that came out of it was compassion. We really worked a lot on compassion because type 2s are actually the ones who tend to have challenges with compassion. They can be very compassionate towards others, but self-compassion is a huge challenge, right? So it helped her really recognize how she was being a good mom and how she was actually taking care of her kids' needs and making sure that these needs were met, but that her business had needs. And what happened as a result are two things. One is she was able to, by having just consistent work on her business daily with really, I would say, sacred time and hours, and having conversations with her husband about, hey, guess what? There's two of us here. You can take these responsibilities, kind of dividing up the responsibilities a bit more and being kind of clearer on that. She was able to dedicate a lot more time to her business. And she had, in the 6 months that we worked together, I think it was maybe even 2 times more business. She had the best revenue she had ever in having her business open, which had been, I think, close to 10 years. Then the really cool thing that happened, and this is the example of the integration point. Type 1 here, you're operating. And beautifully enough, she was able to also move into type 7 and plan some family trips and vacations. She got herself some spa days, but that were more fun for her. So taking care of herself in type 2, but really she added in some dimension of fun, which re-energized her by integrating into type 7, which allowed her to actually enjoy being with her kids more. And she became less, she said she was kind of rigid and a little bit like, we got to get so much stuff done. And she was a lot more joyful as a mom because of that. So her business grew and she was a happier mom in the end. So that's an example.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that example. I think it highlights how having clarity in our lives can be really helpful, even if it's like just thinking about, how we spend time with our sacred space, with our businesses and our families and what that looks like. And then having that piece for joy and fun. I would agree. I think that when we can add in whatever we can with our families, it can be joyful or fun filled. I think that brings a level of levity and excitement to our life, which takes some stress off of ourselves as well. And I'm coming off of the weekend with doing that with my family. So I'm fresh in that like renewed phase in terms of, being out and roller skating and swimming and those types of things. Yeah, that is a really neat way to showcase how the Enneagram can support a person in that balance. And I don't love the word balance ever. I think that LaShawn and I have talked about the balance of, being a caretaker or a mother and then also owning a business, right? Because let's just, name that is hard, right? And that is challenging. So thank you for sharing that. Kind of along the same lines that you were talking about with values, can you talk a little bit more about how values relate to the Enneagram for people?
Yeah, I believe that values are like huge in shaping, well, obviously who you are, but that your values really show up through the lens of the Enneagram. And so there's the obvious way they show up, for instance, like the reformer, the perfectionist, they value integrity, justice, transparency, doing the right thing. So there's core values kind of built into your like superpower aspect of it. Or like type 4, maybe we'll touch on another type. They value like authenticity. Again, both of those are actually authenticity, which is interesting. A depth of emotional connection and really showing up and being uniquely yourself. They value like that creative energy, right? And the enthusiast, for instance, values like freedom, adventure, joyous expression, because they're trying to avoid the limitations of being a human being. They're trying to avoid pain. So those are like the obvious ways that values show up. But then what's also interesting, though, is looking at the blind spots, because if you think about it, actually where you said the word balance, where we can be out of balance also shows our potential value system and where we may need to be working towards. Like, let's look at, for instance, a type 3, which is a great example because type 3s really value success, right? So they value success, they value recognition, they're the achievers. They want people to say, yeah, you did a great job. Hey, you're number one kind of energy, right? But there can be some opportunities for them to develop other values that may support them more. So that I would say there are kind of our key natural values as a type, but also the place where we want to develop maybe more values that would support us. And for instance, type 3's opportunity for growth is develop more authenticity and more self-acceptance, because unfortunately type 3 can take maybe a few little shortcuts. And so they may not be that authentic sometimes, or they may be like, yeah, they don't really need to know about that. But if they focus their values on authenticity and more of service in that direction, they tend to be more successful on their values of success and recognition. Does that make sense? So you can find a lot of growth opportunities for values by looking also at the blind spots. I could say a lot about values, but that gives you some ideas. I think that it's actually really fascinating. One other thing, I do this thing I've done for a long time as a coach, especially when people are looking at either maybe making a transition in their business, or they're wanting to determine like if they want to start a new or different business. I do what I call True Values program that was developed actually by a coaching institution. But what's fascinating is I have them select these values. I have them do their Enneagram typing, and these are totally independent. And so many times they completely match. Like people self-select the same values that their Enneagram type naturally has. And so it's a great way of really validating, like, yes, we have your right type.
I like the way that the Enneagram intersects with values and also with what motivates us. That's one of the things that you were talking about. And the one thing that comes to mind is the idea of other personality profiles that you had mentioned look at the outer behavior, whereas the Enneagram looks at what motivates behavior. That piqued my interest, and I wanted to circle back to that. And based on your background in psychology as well, how does that inform your understanding of how the Enneagram is different from, like, say, the Myers-Briggs or something like that, where you're looking at outer behavior, and with the Enneagram, it's internal? Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way for me to describe this is that with the Enneagram, there are types that have very similar outer behaviors, and they look exactly identical, but there's very different motivations for doing it. And so I think that's where kind of the key lies. So for instance, I'll give you some examples. For instance, like a type 2 and a type 9, which are lookalikes types, the caretaker and the peacemaker. They both have outer behaviors as taking care of people, meeting other people's needs, making sure that everybody's happy. And so if you just take a test online with the Enneagram or something else, you may get that as a result. You may get a high type 9 and a high type 2. You can't be high in both of these, by the way. It's hard to be high in both of them. But what I'm actually alluding to is the following. Type 2's motivation for taking care of people is out of a desire to really be needed and to be seen as lovable, to be seen as somebody, the ideal someone that takes care of you, that's generous and supportive. And so there's a quality, they're an image point. So there's a quality of really wanting to be seen a certain way and be selfless. So they really care about that kind of impact on people, and they will get upset, very upset, if somebody doesn't recognize their generosity, and they might get resentful if people don't give back to them. So they're sort of also expecting some return. Whereas the type 9 over there is also giving and looking very supportive and helping a lot of people out. And yet, what are they doing? They're doing something completely different. What's really motivating them is they don't want to rock the boat. They're trying to create peace. They're trying to get just peaceful, comfortable place where we can all just be cozy together. They don't want anybody to get upset at them, because the biggest fear of type 9 is rocking the boat or people being angry. So actually, they're not trying to get back a lot from you or to get recognition of like, you're the most amazing, loving, supportive human being. They're just trying to make sure that everything is kept in this nice, peaceful container where we can all get along and be happy and peaceful together.
I like how you framed that. And LaShawn and I think, are sitting here, and we know each other so well as friends too. And we're like, oh, we can see this in how we work together too, in a really positive way. And so that's a question I actually have about work versus, for lack of a better word, home identities. Do you see that people show up with one Enneagram type as the high at home and a different one at work, or in different parts of their lives? Is that problematic? Is that okay? Kind of maybe speak to that.
Yes, thank you for that question. First of all, you can only be one type, which is very confusing for some people who tend to think that they might move around the Enneagram. And why is it so confusing? Because the fact is that we have first a wing on each side. So if you're a type 1, you have a type 9 or a type 2 wing. What a lot of people do is the following, is they can be a certain type at home and they can be another type at work. A lot of people take a core type for maybe being at work and maybe they are a wing at home. For instance, you could be a type 1 and you may work be super structured, focused, detail oriented. You're getting lots of things done. Maybe you're a lawyer, an editor, or quality control manager. Those are very stereotypical positions as type 1. But then you go home and at type 2, you totally melt into your wing and you're like, oh, I'm going to take care of my kids and my family. I'm making them food. And so you actually get both sides of you met there. If you have a strong wing, that can happen. The other thing that can happen is you can also decide, without really knowing you're deciding this, you can use one of your integration or your disintegration point as also a core type for you, and you might spend a lot of time there. So just going with type 1, because I'm using this, their disintegration point is type 4. And not to confuse the picture, that's the individualist, by the way. And not to confuse the picture, but you can also integrate to your disintegration point. And that's a long story to tell you why, but you can do that. A lot of type 1s, I've seen great examples of how they use type 4 as a creative outlet. Maybe they, play the guitar and they spend, a couple nights, a month out there, with a band, or they're writing poetry, and it really helps complete that energy. And so they use that type as their creative expression. They tap into that for their hobbies, for the fun part of their life. So I do think that we tend to actually, without realizing it, kind of use our type for different aspects of our lives, the types that we can connect to. Remember, every type has basically 5 types, including their own type that they're working with.
Well, there seems to be so many different parts to the Enneagram. It seems like one would need a PhD to understand the Enneagram, but it's fascinating. I love the wings integration, the disintegration. There's just so much there. And I'm wondering, what are some words of wisdom that you have you could apply to someone who doesn't know that much about the Enneagram, like myself and Erin, and our listeners? Just some things that you could apply to your life that you have learned about the Enneagram. Of course, learn the Enneagram and get to know the Enneagram and get a hold of Margot and learn more about that. It just sounds like you could really expand and really know yourself very well through the Enneagram. But just like words of wisdom that you would impart to our listeners and people who are interested in the Enneagram.
Well, thanks for that. One of the things that I like to say about the Enneagram is the Enneagram. Well, first of all, some people think about it as kind of being in a box. They're just like, oh my gosh, this is going to box me into a certain number. Do I really want to be that number? And how can we all be the same? And there's this kind of boxed in thought. I don't know if you've ever had that thought about the Enneagram. And so some people are kind of concerned about that, and they think of it as a limitation. I would suggest, this is my word of wisdom, that you look at it more as a liberation, as a way of getting in touch and kind of beginning to explore and becoming more aware of what really makes you tick. And the first question I think to ask yourself really is, what actually is making me do this or that? What is driving me to take certain action steps? It's super fascinating to look at the inner motivations. And so the more you can tune into what's driving you, and through the Enneagram, it's really a shortcut because you can kind of see quickly what's driving somebody. But also what's really helpful is you can sort of look at then, what are your blind spots? What are those unhealthy patterns that have plagued you most of your existence? Or maybe because you've been working on yourself a long time, you've overcome some of those, but those unhealthy patterns are a real key to unlocking the Enneagram. So just even making a note of, these are kind of what might motivate me. These are my superpowers. These are my unhealthy patterns. All of those gives you a sense of what the Enneagram type might be for you. And it's just much easier and faster to be able to uncover this by being able to look at what number you are. I do offer a free 10-question assessment test to give you an idea. That said, that just really points you in a direction. And one thing about this for me is that it is an exploration of self, and it can take some exploring to really nail down your type. That's why I love doing in-depth 90-minute Enneagram typing sessions that are really in-depth with somebody, where they understand not just their type, but all 9 types and kind of how they all fit together, because it is an exploration. And then to take that on and see how that shows up in your life. One of the things is you might not be happy to know your type. I'm going to tell you the truth. I was extremely unhappy to learn I was a type 6. I fought tooth and nail about it. Like type 3. In fact, I pretended to be a type 3 for 2 years. Finally, I had somebody who was like, no, Margot, you are a type 6 and you better face it if you really want to learn about yourself. You can't hide out in type 3 anymore. Type 3 seemed great. The achiever, it was in alignment with what we were expected to be as human beings, these great productive human beings. And over here in type 6, oh no, I'm the one who has fear, self-doubt, security issues. Who wants to be that? I'm being really real. I was super unhappy about it. However, once I learned about this, it unlocked something really huge for me, and it really was big and impactful. And so the ego may really be kicking and screaming about learning its type. And I think it happens for every type. You're like, oh no, that's really me and my shadow side. I don't know if I really want to know that. However, I think it's probably the most useful thing you can do as a human being, as an entrepreneur, as a mother, father, whatever roles you play, is to learn the game that your ego is playing and the strategies it's working with to, survive in this world, and hopefully survive, not just survive, but thrive.
I really like that framing of bringing in the ego here too, and how it can tell us lies, right? Consistently, and how we work with that as well. And I have a question, because when I was working at the university, I did my Enneagram type, and then we would do like a kind of a shorter version of it with students. But I think the way you talked about 90-minute deep dive, just in my basic understanding of things, I think that would be so helpful versus just taking the assessment and maybe having like a 20-minute conversation about it or whatever. I think this is the type of assessment that needs a lot of scaffolding and understanding. So that's really cool that you provide that opportunity, a full 90 minutes to do that deep dive to your clients. So for people listening out there, Margot is your person for that, for doing those deep dives on the Enneagram. And then my question with this is, can people change their Enneagram type? So let's say I took the assessment 5 years ago. Is it going to be the same 5 years later, or will it be different?
My understanding is that you cannot change your Enneagram type. My understanding is that you can grow in your Enneagram type. So there are different levels of health in each type. And of course, you can integrate to your integration point, which may change the flavor of who you are substantially and may make you look differently. However, if you have correctly typed yourself originally, you should always remain the same type. Because what I understand, and of course, this is hypothesis to some degree, is that somewhere between the ages of 5 and 9, certain events occur in your life, which make your ego adopt a certain strategy, which is one of these 9 strategies to survive. And this flavor, these challenges continue your entire life. However, what happens to a lot of people when they're doing self-assessment tests, or even any kind of typing session, unless you're with somebody who really is going to grill you a bit about what's really happening, is that you could be in a really pessimistic mood and actually throw your entire test results into your disintegration place and your stress place, or you could have been living in your stress place like I was. I lived in my stress place in type 3 for 10 years of my life, my entire 20s. And I thought that's who I was because of that. Or you could throw yourself actually into your integration point and be like, oh, I'm actually this really, integrated human being over here, which is great. You're in a really positive space, but that's actually not the truth either. And what happens is that you don't relate to the other points that you need to relate to because you have to look at this as a whole. This is a holistic approach. You have your core type, and it needs to make sense, and you need to be able to relate to your disintegration and your integration point, and to one of your wings at least. And if you don't have connection to that, what happens for most people is that they don't really get the Enneagram. They get a number and they don't really use it or understand it. And that's actually what my mission is about right now, and why I have the Enneagram Edge podcast. Is I really want people to use this information and benefit from it, and not just think it's kind of cool and fun.
It's great that you mentioned your podcast. I was going to say, why don't you go ahead and tell us where we can find you and more about that?
Okay, so in the show notes, I hope to be able to give you some links, but there's a couple things. The Enneagram Edge is the name of my podcast. It's available on Spotify, Apple, and Buzzsprout, and theenneagramedge.com. So you'll be able to hear all about that. It's actually a podcast that's geared to helping you really understand the Enneagram and harness its power in your life and business. So there's an entrepreneurial aspect to it. I also offer, like I said before, attached to a lot of these podcasts, some freebies, some opportunities to learn about the Enneagram. So I have the 10-question assessment test. I also have ways to improve your productivity. So I have the personalized productivity blueprint for by type. Really cool. You go on there and you actually click on your type, and you have it about your specific type, how to improve your productivity. So that's another freebie you can have. And then coming up soon, in a week and a half, I'm doing my next episode of the Enneagram Edge on no-go zones. And I will be offering a free Find Out Your No-Go Zone with a little personalized quiz. So there's a lot of fun freebies on the Enneagram Edge front. I'm also doing some other things. Should I chat about them?
Maybe a couple things really briefly, and then we'll get into maybe the coaching nuggets of wisdom.
Okay. Oh, I was just going to say one last thing too, is I'm doing a productivity workshop for entrepreneurs called the Productivity Accelerator that starts on March 5th. And so that's really all about how do you harness the power of your type actually, and use it to enhance productivity by just using 20 minutes a day.
Awesome.
Right. Sounds good. And that will all be in the show notes. All right. So we are at that point in our podcast where we talk about coaching nuggets of wisdom. And those are basically, we just kind of boil down themes, things that have stuck out for us that we impart at the end of the episode, kind of things that people can take away. So usually either Erin or myself go first, and then Margot will have you end with your own coaching nugget of wisdom. So Erin, do you have something in mind?
The one thing that's occurring to me right now is, with the Enneagram or other personality assessments, we might take those online or take them in a one-off training or a workshop and think we might have enough of what we need. But I think this speaks to the power of the coaching process, right? We need the assessment with the coaching support to be able to understand our assessments that we take better, to be able to integrate them, and to be able to really make them work for us. So I think that's a key takeaway that I have for our listeners today.
Yeah, that is such a good point. Having a guide, someone who can help you understand the results when you take those assessments. My coaching nugget of wisdom that's really stuck out for me while Margot was talking is the idea of sacred spaces. And it seems that sacred spaces are a really important part of growth and an important part of achieving a sense of well-being in your life. So where are your sacred spaces? Where can you provide sacred spaces for yourself in your life? Okay, Margot.
I love both of those. I think I'm going to focus on compassion. One of the big takeaways or coaching nugget is self-compassion. I think the Enneagram is a great tool for that. And even if you don't know your type, to start focusing on more self-compassion, we could always use some, and realizing that, okay, this is just a behavior. This is just something I do. It's not who I am. And to separate that out and understand that is, I think, a real doorway to compassion. And then to add on also compassion for others, it's really helpful looking at the lens of the Enneagram to get like, oh, not everybody is like me. We are all different human beings. We know for sure there's 9 types and there's 9 different, different ways of being. And there's even more than that, really. And it's not really that it's not that there's something wrong with them or that they're being mean to me. It's more likely that they're just a different type. They're just a different Enneagram type. And so to work on having more compassion for people who are different than us, I think is really important right now. So just bringing in the thought of focusing on how to cultivate more self-compassion and compassion for others through this thought of, hey, they're just a different type with different values, different drives, different fears.
Thank you, Margot. We have been speaking with Margot Zaher, who is the owner of Empowered Now Coaching, where transformation meets tangible
Thanks for joining
results.
us for Coaching as Benevolence. I'm LaShawn with Michelle's Sage Place, Positive Intelligence Coaching.
And I'm Erin with Roots and Wings, Grief and Loss Coaching.
Have a benevolent day.